what's the best grouping for learning? Now, obviously, the background to this talk is how can we help virtually all children, particularly that go to schools, how can we help them learn? Um, Not all of you will have gone through the Oxbridge system. I myself have not gone through Oxbridge, but I've been around, I've examined there, and I've got great sort of jealousy in terms of actually having a system that uses different types of groups for different types of orientations towards learning. Obviously, if I want to, as in this context, give a large-scale lecture, Oxford and Cambridge have large-scale lectures. But they also have a point where um, individual tutorials with a tutor help to draw out particular sort of understandings working on virtually one-to-one basis. And at times there are all sort of small-scale seminars with 6, 7 students where you can exchange a range of ideas within a context that involves everyone. If you take that as sort of an ideal sort of pedagogic context, and you then say, well, what happens in schools? We tend not to get that sort of notion of individual tutorials, small group seminars, and large lectures. What we get are classes of 25 to 35 children. Depending where you are in the world, you may have much larger classes, but you probably will tend not to have much lower classes. And within those classes, within schools, the key problem still remains, how do we promote learning for all students? Okay. So we know to me, probably the most effective way of promoting it is not really taking place. So really what we want to do is through this talk a little bit about sort of the history of education, grouping and schooling, problems and ambiguities that arise within it, and what needs to be coped with. Hence, I'll be sort of covering a range of different psychologies, as I explained just before, particularly having to do towards the end. There will be aspects of developmental psychology. There will be aspects of social psychology. There'll be aspects of interpersonal psychology. There will be aspects of relational psychology. And I'll try to bring all those in much clearer focus towards the end of the talk. Basically, I mean, if we talk about sort of history of schooling, once we've gone beyond sort of individual children having tutors coming into a school system, there tends to be problems of how we handle sort of children with multiple ages and multiple attainments within any sort of classroom. If any of you if you watch any sort of daytime British television these days and you put onto a movie channel, invariably they go into American cowboy westerns. And if you ever see sort of one of their classrooms, you get this ideal sort of picture of, maybe 10, 20 children, all different ages, all different heights, but they all seem to be working together. The key question from there is in terms of attainment, are each one of these children getting the type of information which is at the level that they're working at, challenging for them, and particular to the types of orientation they have, what do they want to learn about? Okay, we don't really get that in today's classrooms in Western countries. Now, I guess another proviso. I am going to be basically talking about Western countries and predominantly studies which have been done in the UK and in the United States. If you want to go into sort of variations of Confucian heritage cultures, which we'd find in Asia, I can do that, but I'll respond to questions about that. So I'm just giving you some general sort of parameters. When we have children in Western classrooms now, uh, invariably, school systems have decided that age level is one of the basic way of putting children into groups. So we have classrooms by age group. But even within classroom by age groups, there's going to be a range of attainment levels. There's going to be a whole variation of friendships. There's going to be quite possibly ethnic differences and a whole range of differences that children are not the same. And the expectation is that they need to have much more sort of tailored sort of tutelage within their classrooms. Let me sort of identify within this sort of quadrant here. Uh, there's four sections that I'm going to talk about. Uh, the first is really thinking about grouping children for organizational purposes by year grouping. And we've got a number of terms, be them North American or UK-based terms of tracking, streaming, setting, mixed ability. I'll explain each one of these terms uh, in the next slide, but I just want to show that differentiation is that a lot of ability grouping is there for organizational purposes rather than for particular sort of learning purposes. And they want to keep those sort of separate. And I also then want to separate out that if we're talking about whole year grouping, what actually happens within classrooms, both organizationally and for learning purposes. So broadly, what I'll be talking about for the next half hour or so will fall within to these sort of four different sort of quadrants. Okay. From there, let's just talk about basic sort of terms. Now, I would imagine most of you will be familiar with these terms if you work in education, if you've been in schools recently. Uh, Tracking and streaming refers to that practice in which pupils are assigned to their classes on the basis of the overall assessment of supposedly their general ability. That's usually based upon prior attainment, or outcomes from some cognitive or some sort of test. Okay, so children of the same ability in a year group are placed into a particular track or a particular stream. When they're in doing so, they are consistently taught all of their subjects with that group of children. Uh, that there is very little sort of differentiation in terms of the curriculum between sort of low attaining children versus higher attaining children. They're still taught the same curriculum. They're taught in different sort of ability groups. Okay. Banding is very similar to tracking or streaming, except instead of having very tightly sort of ability-based sort of groups, your groupings of children are slightly larger. So you'll have quite high ability to higher mid ability, and you'll have sort of mid ability to lower mid ability, low mid ability to lower ability in groupings. Bandings have been used such that there isn't quite as much alienation between children, particularly when you compare the sociological studies of tracking and streaming, which show quite strong sort of differences in attitude and in antagonism between sort of high ability groups versus low ability groups. We'll get into more explanation of that as we go on. Setting, again, is another differentiated ability practice, but setting is much more sensitive to particular sort of subject areas. So you will have sort of ability grouping for English, ability grouping for mathematics, ability grouping for science in a large number of schools. Your children who may be scoring higher in mathematics as opposed to English and literature obviously would be in higher sets for their mathematics and mid to lower sets for their literature and English. Okay. Again, children are differentiated. And all of these sort of tracking, streaming, banding, setting are all quite different from mixed ability classrooms where you have children from across the ability range within a single classroom. Okay. You tend not to find many classrooms that have mixed ability these days, both in primary schools, certainly in the UK, and certainly in secondary schools. Setting up children organizationally like this then sets out certain criteria in terms of, are children more likely to succeed, less likely to succeed within these organizational sort of contexts. Okay. And within this, we also get the question here, by sorting out by ability, do children really get some sort of advantage? The first thing to bear in mind, and first qualification in my own speaking, is I've been using probably the term ability too often, because these really aren't ability groups that are predefined and going to last with the child forever. They're attainment groups. Okay, and attainment groups is how you score in some sort of testing. Right? So you may score well, hence you're put into a high attainment group, but people just tend to mix the terms together, ability versus attainment. Psychologically, there's quite a difference between these terms in terms of ability being some sort of internal characteristic that is unlikely to change. Attainment is how you perform on a particular test at a particular time, and hence is likely to be changed. I mean, both with ability and attainment, as a hint of another key point later on in the talk, that has got to be matched with somebody who can judge that ability or attainment and how often that judgment might be made. So in theory, if you read about sort of ability grouping and why it has come about, it needs to have a teacher or a particular person who can identify children's ability. If that ability is starting to drop, should they go into a lower set? Should they go into a lower stream? If children in lower streams start to excel within that group, should they be placed upward? So it has to do with sort of somebody judging the actual performance of children, how well that judgment is made, and trying to get over excluding sort of bias in that. Three types of studies, large-scale studies, question whether putting children into some sort of attainment grouping or ability grouping as opposed to mixed ability grouping, will that provide overall for all children sort of a greater level of attainment? So we've got studies, PISA studies, Pearl studies, and a number of meta-analytic studies. I can probably, well, no, let me just move into explaining the PISA studies, or going through that. Let me jump onto there. The PISA is a program for international student development. Hopefully a number of you will know about PISA. They're done every few years. The studies that I'll be citing come from the mid sort of 2010s, around 2012 to 2015. The studies take place about every 5 years. There's probably some more recent studies, but the statistics from this are easily accessible. They compare particularly 15-year-olds in a large number of countries. So the 2014, 2015 PISA studies that I'll be citing are drawn from 65 countries. They are supposed to be drawn from a random and a representative set of schools from these 65 countries, and they looked at children's sort of attainment in mathematics, science, and reading. They're also take into account the type of school it is, whether the children, for purpose of this talk, are in some sort of attainment grouping versus mixed attainment groupings, okay? And what we get from the range of studies is that, number one, when you compare the amount of attainment of children within ability-based groupings, sort of attainment-based, ability-based versus mixed ability groups, there's not a lot of difference in terms of their performance. Okay. So if you compare the performance of lower attaining children to higher attaining children in ability grouped classes versus mixed ability classes, not much difference comes out from there. There's a number of qualifications that go on within this, because when we're comparing sort of the children put into ability groupings, we're talking about an average of how all the high, middle, and low sort of attaining children perform versus how the children in mixed ability classes perform. Okay. So there will be variations in that. We know that the top ability children in the high ability, high attaining sets tend to score higher than you would get in a mixed ability group, and comparing to sort of high ability children in a mixed ability context, right? Whereas particularly lower ability children in attainment-based grouping perform much lower than children in mixed ability groupings. Okay, hopefully that's clear enough. And therefore you can then sort of see, basically, when we compare sort of attainment-based grouping versus mixed ability grouping, we're basically talking about sort of averages. And uh, the average between very high ability in stream, set, track classes plus and low ability could on average give you slightly less of an overall outcome, attainment outcome, compared to the general average outcome for mixed ability classes. This is curious because certainly the UK government, particularly within England, has I'm just trying to remember for how long, probably back into the 1980s, been posing we need more ability-based classrooms. We need to have higher level, we need to maintain more attainment classes uh, uh, amongst more subjects. Uh, One of the reasons for that is that there's very little evidence of this heterogeneous or mixed ability grouping taking place in school. It's far easier, particularly at secondary school level, but often dropping down into primary schools now. It's much easier for secondary schools to basically use setting, streaming, um, in terms of their organization of children. And they tend not to listen to the actual sort of studies, which say there really isn't much difference between this homogeneous grouping by ability versus heterogeneous mixed ability sort of grouping. Okay. Um, from there, hopefully I don't have anybody panicking at this point. Because it goes against a lot of practices, certainly in the UK, what goes on in schools. The Pearl study, which is international progress in the progress in international reading and literacy, very similar to the previous studies, focus on basically reading and literacy, and again come across from multiple countries. We're working with a lower age group of 9 to 10-year-olds, and looking at their sort of reading and literacy sort of abilities, and their again outcomes are showing that when you have tracked, streamed, set classes, they tend not to. Certainly, there isn't a great deal of difference uh, in their sort of attainment scores compared to heterogeneous or mixed ability classes. Uh, in fact, there's slight disadvantage to tracking, setting, or streaming your children in reading uh, compared to the heterogeneous classes, basically due to the explanations here are that when you have children from a range of different sort of attainment levels in their reading, they will read a range of different books. They will have a range of different topics that they talk about, and the children tend to talk to one another. Hence, sharing of attitudes, um, sharing of books, sharing of ideas tends to spur on particularly those lower attaining children within the classroom, and it brings up their sort of scores. There's more sort of help giving from higher attaining children within a mixed attaining classroom, and children who are lower attaining tend to be more seeking of help and opportunities from children who are working at different levels from them. So what we start to see a difference between sort of the homogeneous separating out sort of ability groups versus mixed ability groups is not just very, very small sort of attainment differences when you compare them, but it starts to bring in social dimensions of the ability to help share with ideas in the classroom, moving into how social contexts may facilitate attainment. On the other hand, more sociologically, if you go into studies of the homogeneous sort of class, homogeneous schools, or groups that schools that that differentiate the children by their attainment level, you do get perhaps higher levels of attainment amongst some of the very high ability sort of groups, but you also then get a bit of social alienation from the lower ability groups who tend to see that they don't perform well. They may not be in preferred sort of learning situations. And I'll explain a little bit more about this. Notice both both of these previous studies are based upon sort of correlational evidence. They're not really causal. They haven't sort of longitudinally followed individual students through. So, we're not working with absolute sort of because of this, that happens. It's basically correlational evidence. Um, if we move into meta-analytic studies about sort of these homogeneous ability grouping versus a mixed ability or heterogeneous, we move into just a few more sort of insights tend to be generated. Um, uh, these comparisons basically go back to the 1980s, where the classic studies by Kulik and Kulik were comparing children in sort of homogeneous attainment differentiated classrooms versus mixed ability classrooms, and finding again that when you look at the average scores of all the sort of homogeneous sort of classes versus mixed ability classes, there's not much of a significant difference between them. Effect size tends to be very, very small. Kulik and Kulik are, particularly if you go back and you read them, you will find that at times they come up with articles that talk about sort of how high attaining children have uh, more advantage or have greater attainment than other ability groups within sort of those sort of homogeneous sort of classes, differentiated classes. Um, just a quick point that when you look at Kulik and Kulik, you might just want to check who funds them. And a number of the studies that have been funded by I think it's called the Gifted Society of America. And so they were basically sort of funded to look at how high attaining children work within particular context and what's the best context for them. What they found was when you compared between the different sort of ability groupings, there's not much difference going on compared to mixed ability. Um, Similar, Robert Slavin's done a number of these meta-analytical studies. Again, these are 30 years old, but more recent studies don't really seem to differentiate from their findings. Two sets of studies done by Robert Slavin and his colleagues, again, found virtually no difference when you compare the averages of homogeneous base groupings versus heterogeneous base groupings. Again, John Hattie in Australia has done further sort of meta-analyses, finding the same type of thing. Myself and Peter Blatchford, Ed Baines, who are at the Institute of Education, did a range of 24 case studies in the UK, where we particularly went to secondary schools and talked to the people that were in charge of the organization of the secondary schools to find out how they grouped their children. And obviously, we found that the vast majority of these schools were grouping by attainment, sort of homogeneous sort of groupings. We then looked at value-added scores from Key Stage 3, or Key Stage 3 are 13, 14-year-olds, to Key Stage 4, 15, 16-year-olds, to see if your school had sort of settings, streaming, tracking versus mixed ability, were you getting more value added, more attainment from these particular children? So we're able to, in a sense, assess pre and post, you might want to call it, at two different time points, how much advantage children got from the type of grouping circumstances that they were in. And basically what we found was, again, no big difference between those schools that had sort of homogeneous versus heterogeneous groupings. And in fact, the two schools that had the most advantage, that had gained the most in value-added scores, was one school with the most extreme sort of homogeneous ability, and the other school had the most extreme mixed ability. At that point, it was just interesting that we were getting very similar sort of results out of extremely different sort of grouping situations. Yet, at the same time, when we did this study, which was for the Department for Education in England, we were then told that really are those really your results, because it contradicts what we want schools to do these days, because what the current government at that point was saying is they wanted more setting, more homogeneous ability grouping within schools. Judy Ireson, who's done a lot of work with Sue Hallam at the Institute of Education, again has looked at a more refined, rather than just sort of tracking and streaming, actually looked at setting in English, mathematics, and science in 45 secondary schools across England. And again, comparing setting to sort of mixed ability sort of classes, they found very little difference in terms of the average sort of outcomes from them. Becky Francis, another study, much more recent, 2017, was looking particularly at the role of socioeconomic status in terms of ability grouping. And obviously, the first thing one finds is that children in the higher attaining sort of groups in tracking, streaming, and setting tend to come from higher social class. And whether you want to bring in sort of notions of educational capital to explain this, there's a number of explanations. Similarly, with particular sort of potential teacher bias. Francis particularly had started out that study in 2017 with the purpose of really wanting to compare sort of homogeneously grouped versus heterogeneously grouped classes. But basically, again, in terms of schools that agreed to work with them, there were virtually no schools that universally used heterogeneous grouping for their classrooms. So what Francis has got was very much more sort of a weighted towards sort of setting, streaming, and tracking as preferred styles within school, preferred organizational style, but did not really have a great deal of evidence to say that this was a particularly effective way of grouping students. Okay. The variations, I mean, there is a bit of variation that's consistent that we get from Kulik and Slavin, Hattie, Ireson, and that is that if we look within the differentiated, the highest of tracked groups versus the lowest of tracked groups, we find that there tends to be more attainment in the higher tracked groups, obviously, than the lower tracked groups. But if you're comparing that to heterogeneous groups, then everything is you don't get that type of clarity. And consistently, schools, certainly in the UK, and I think a large number in the United States, tend to have these grouping by tracking these homogeneous groups without a good level of explanation as to why they should be there. We bring out a particular point that the more differentiated your groups are within school, the more homogeneous your groups are, it's likely to cause problems, particularly with the lowest attaining groups, who tend to become sort of alienated for a number of purposes. And I'll get into that in just a moment. It tends to disadvantage low attainers who also tend to be in the lower attaining sort of homogeneous groups, tend to come from lower social classes. Right. Let's get into some of the things that happen within classrooms and some explanations for, in one sense, the differentiation in homogeneous groups are found. Jo Boler, who started undertaking her studies in 2000 in UK-based classrooms, Boler is now at Stanford, and doing probably similar studies. I mean, she obviously has moved on in 20 years. In 2000, she particularly looked in secondary school sort of mathematics and was questioning whether children in highly tracked classrooms or highly streamed classrooms or highly set classrooms were doing better or worse than children in the lower set classrooms. And basically, she focused on mathematics and found that obviously, as one would expect, if you're comparing the highest of the high in terms of ability grouping and how they're attaining in schools with the lowest of the low in a year grouping and how they're attaining in schools, there is a major difference between them. But when you look at the differences, aside from them being organized into different classes like this, that the higher quality teachers, teachers who had their master's degrees, potentially sort of doctorate degrees, tend to be assigned to teach the higher attaining classes. Teachers that had not so much sort of advanced training in their mathematics tended to be assigned to lower ability classrooms or lower track classrooms. Curriculums tended to be different as well, that the higher track classes got more stimulating sort of mathematical challenging problems. When you went down to the low track sort of classrooms, they got very much drill and practice, repetition, and not challenging sort of problems. So much you sit down and do, repeat and do, and that with teachers who did not have that firm of a grasp of mathematics. So we start to see that when you look at sort of the homogeneous types of grouping, there'll be a strong differentiation between them. Similarly, Becky Francis, 2017, in their sort of mathematics, science, and other classes, identified that, again, the top homogeneous, the highest attaining classrooms tended to have higher quality teachers. When they talked to the teachers of the different sort of ability grouped classes, teachers' expectations were different. Their expectations for the high ability classes, yes, they can perform, we can challenge, we can be freer with them, where the expectation for the lower attaining classes that just no, they need much more of the drill, practice, repetition, and we have to keep control of their behavior. Further, if your sort of homogeneous group is going to work, as I mentioned earlier, teachers need to be aware when a child is underperforming within a particular ability group, such that they might be able to be put into a lower ability group and they might be able to perform better there. And those in lower ability groups who tend to perform higher, should they be moved upwards into sort of higher set levels or higher attainment groups. And this is where sort of bias and prejudice seems to come in, and that again, higher ability kids got much more sort of teacher attention and expectation. When lower ability children tend to perform better, they were often missed in terms of allocating them into a higher ability sort of grouping. A number of these sort of explanations may come up from, I don't know if any of you go back to 1968 with the Rosenthal and Jacobson study of Pygmalion in the classroom. I'll give you sort of a very, very quick sort of rendition of this. They worked in an elementary school in Los Angeles in the early 1960s. At this point, sort of IQ testing was being sort of brought in a number of schools in the States. I'm not sure particularly what for, but Rosenthal and Jacobson came up with a sort of expectancy, sort of self-fulfilling prophecy hypothesis that if we identify children as potential high performers and just tell the teachers one time that these children will perform better than others, will that have an effect? Will teachers' expectations have an effect? And again, they went into sort of Los Angeles elementary schools. I can't remember, I think this class was about 10 or 11-year-olds that they just told teachers one time, they just randomly picked 10% of the class to say, after an IQ test was given, they just randomly picked 10 children in the class and said, these children are going to be high performers or spurters. And by the end of the school year, when they sort of redid the IQ test, whereas on average, children moved up 3 or 4 IQ points over that school year, on average, these spurters moved up 10 IQ points per year. And the only explanation they came up from was this one time teachers were told that these children were likely to move. Okay, so we know that there's a whole range of expectations that might come in from racial bias, ethnic bias. You might even say color of eyes. There's been numbers of studies on that as well. Teacher expectations has a large, or can play a large amount in terms of children's attainment, and particularly when you go back into like the Francis and Boulder studies, that if teachers are responsible to identify who's likely to move up, who's likely to move down, where do their biases sort of come in? Moving away from a teacher expectancy, children themselves have expectancies. And so if you look at Marsh's studies, I mean, I just cite the 2008, where he talks about sort of uh, small fish in big ponds and big fish in small ponds. Basically, what he's saying is children in classrooms are likely to compare themselves to each other. If you're a teacher in an elementary school classroom, in a secondary school classroom, and you've given out a test, and you may hand back your test individually to every children, within a few minutes, everybody in the class knows who scored highest, who scored lowest, without the teacher needing to announce it. Children compare themselves to each other, and obviously fit into where they perceive themselves in terms of classroom attainment. So obviously it's going to be much more sort of fulfilling if you know that you're scoring at the top of your class. It's going to be less fulfilling if you know that you're scoring at the bottom of the class. Okay. And hence children's academic sort of profiles and academic selfhoods get compared across the classroom by the children themselves. And then you can see that sort of magnified, that if you have classes that are sort of homogeneous, okay, high ability classes, then children already start out by knowing that they're in a higher set. But then even within that, in terms of Marsh's characteristics, even within that, if you're in a high attaining class, but you're scoring at the low end of all the other children in that high attaining class, you're less likely to improve in your attainment. If you're that type of person who's scoring high in a high attaining class, then you move upwards. So we've got that children take on. They've got their own sort of mentalities based upon social comparison to others. If we look at Henri Tajfel's work about in-groups and out-groups within class, again, children's sort of social identities are developed and formed by who they compare themselves with. And they're likely to compare themselves with those who are similar to themselves and those who are different from themselves in terms of in-groups versus out-groups. And if you provide a legitimization of in-group, out-group due to the attainment class that you're in, you can see how children, and this goes down into sociological studies done by people like Colin Lacey and Stephen Ball in the UK, where they've worked in secondary schools that a very strong sort of streaming setup in there, that the lower attaining children just feel alienated from the higher attaining children. And not only do they perform worse, but they also are antagonistic towards the higher attaining kids. Okay. If we move into something like Elizabeth Cohen's work in the United States, again in the 1990s particularly, Cohen was a sociologist, but verged over into a social psychology and looked in classrooms in terms of children's social status. Okay, so this sort of overlaps again, basically with Marsh, but also sort of in-group, out-group type of studies. That the more you identify children in terms of the being in high sort of high status, has performing well in the classroom as opposed to low status not performing well, children become alienated from each other within the classroom. And Cohen at that point then sort of went very much into a social psychological sort of orientation of proposing what you need is a much more cooperative learning, where you make up groups within classrooms which are heterogeneous groups across cross sections of high, middle, low ability children within classroom, to make up groups, and you put them into cooperative learning situations. And hence that tends to overcome some of the status differentiation that comes out from attainment grouping. Right. Let me go and do a quick time check. I'll try to tie things up in the next couple of minutes, and then we get time for questions. I haven't been interrupted at all, so I don't know whether I've totally bored everyone and put them to sleep, or else everyone's so enthusiastic they can't wait till question time. Anyways, um, let me come back into sort of a classroom level thing now and talk about studies that I've done with Peter Blatchford, who's at the Institute of Education. We've been working together since about the mid 1990s and looking at groups in classrooms and how they're structured. Um, and we know if we talk to children, who do they like to sit with? They have preferred seating partners if the teacher doesn't assign them a particular seat. If you look at who they sit with, then there's a likelihood of, particularly in primary schools, I'd imagine also strong in secondary schools, they'd like to sit with children of the same sex, and they tend to like seating with children of the same attainment level. And what you then get in a classroom where a teacher has allowed children to use their preferred seating partners, you can differentiate the tables because there tend to be the high ability girls at one table and low attaining boys at another table, and that. Hence, left to their own, children's own sort of stereotypes will naturally put them into some sort of fairly um, attainment-based and differentiation-based sort of groupings, unless the teachers adopt an approach to the classroom such as Cohen recommended in terms of cooperative learning groups. Okay, um, in terms of seating partners and advance, I'm going to get on to a little bit of Christine Howe's work in a moment, but well, let me just talk about Christine's right now. Is that in looking at studies that enhance sort of cognitive development of children within their classroom, uh, one of the basic background issues that comes from uh, Piaget, that comes from Wilhelm Dwaz, that comes from people like Paul Light in this country, which are all sort of much earlier sort of developmental psychologists. The point is that children need to interact with each other in order to stimulate sort of their cognitive understanding. There's been a number of related studies that if I jump onto, I've got, if I jump into here, people like Paul Light would have um, he compared children's sort of cognitive performance if they had an individual cognitive problem that they had to solve individually versus if they had time to work with a partner to solve the problem and then come back and ask. And basically, Light and others had shown that working with a peer provides more advanced sort of cognitive understanding. Now, Christine Howe, working with Andy Tomey and a number of others in that field, then looked at, well, how do you put pairs together? Do we just put children together that are at the same sort of cognitive level in terms of their attainment? Well, if you do that, you will get an interaction between them and obviously some sort of development. What happens though, if you take a slightly higher, but slightly more cognitively advanced child and put with a slightly lower cognitively advanced child, and the expectation back in sort of the 1960s, 1970s, and that higher versus a mid or lower sort of cognitive attainment, you'd get sort of a regression to the mean that the higher ability child would come down, lower ability would come up. But what you actually find from Howe's and others' work is that both children advance cognitively. Okay, so you don't get onto that. When you that then works into work such as Noreen Webb's work at UCLA. Hopefully, Christine, I haven't misquoted you too much. Great. If you look at Noreen Webb's work at UCLA in Los Angeles, she tried to get teachers, recommended teachers, group by banding. Hence, that children work in groups within their classrooms, but their groups have a mixture of ability, but not too extreme. You don't put the highest ability groups with the lowest ability children. You have sort of high to mid and mid to lower mid and lower mid to sort of lower ability. And that creates that type of cognitive atmosphere where all children can progress. Okay, let me sort of jump back to where I was a couple of seconds ago. Um, and hence, the point that I'm trying to make is the type of interactions that go on within the classroom are extremely sort of important. If we look at this following chart that comes from, it, it's based upon theory about sort of size of grouping as opposed to the intellectual level of grouping. Um, and the type of learning tests that teachers give within classrooms. Individuals are very good for drill and practice sessions. But if you put children in a pair and you give them a drill and practice task, what are they likely to do? They're likely to talk to one another. If they talk to one another, they're likely to go off task. Okay. But if you give that pair of children a cognitive problem to solve, then they have different perspectives, they can communicate well, and they're able to sort of advance sort of cognitively. Um, when you go into sort of um, triads free is always sort of a problematic sort of group. Uh, there are some people, if you talk to my colleague Ed Baines, he thinks triads work similarly to cognitive groups if you give sort of the appropriate sort of problem. If you look at people again in the States like William Damon, Damon says that moving from a dyad into a triad becomes a movement from a cognitive exchange of two people who may have different perspectives into a power relationship in a triad where two children may have a similar perspective from a third. And if that similar perspective is at a lower cognitive level, that may drive the more advanced child downwards. So there's problems about sort of triads and group sizes. Um, Small groups, 6 to 7 children, are good for applying tasks. Bring different ways that once you come to an understanding at a cognitive level, then you can apply that understanding in different sort of contexts. If you have a small group that is able to work with one another, then they're able to share different sort of applications and different perspectives. Uh, Now, knowing that different sort of group sizes um, relates to different types of problems you can assign to children. Again, Peter Blatcher and myself observe both in primary school classrooms and secondary school classrooms. Do teachers differentiate their group size by the types of tasks they give them? And what we got was a resounding no. That when you had a cognitive task, it could have gone to an individual, small group, large group, whole class. When you had a drill and practice, children were often sat next to one another. And what you found was sort of dysfunctional sort of group sizes compared to the tasks that go on within them. Um, Knowing that time's sort of running fast, I'm going to skip on to just another couple of points from sort of this final slide, and to bring in, I guess, a number of sort of summary, sort of psychological sort of explanations. I mean, we know from the straight sort of comparison of homogeneous versus heterogeneous sort of groupings, there isn't a basic average attainment difference between those groups in terms of children's learning in school. But we do know that if you use the homogeneous grouping, there's likely to be conflicts with the lowest ability children being dissatisfied by not only the, call it the ranking within the school, but also the teachers and possibly misallocations from that. On the other hand, in terms of, if you're going to put children together in a group, in a classroom, and how should this be productive? We can go back theorizing to people like Kurt Lewin, sort of originator of action research, particularly participative action research. Again, Lewin, if you read his history, it won't go too much into that, as sort of uh, a Jewish academic immigrant in early sort of World War II, had a basic problem that, how do you get children to be much more participative, to be engaged, to be more sort of, call it democratic in that sort of sense, and identified that you need to give them a commonality, you need to give them a common goal, you need to let them work together, you need to let them collaborate, cooperate, etc. Similarly, we then see Elizabeth Cohen in the States sort of picking up on that, that if you have status differences within the classroom, you're likely to get alienation, which is going to impact upon certainly a number of children's learning in the classroom and behavior problems. Hence, she recommends cooperative learning scenarios where children sort of can learn that we could over status differences, different points of view, come into a group, and people are able to share, children are able to share and move ahead. Uh, Robert Slavin, David and Roger Johnson, who've done a lot of studies on cooperative learning, show across subjects, across sort of age groups, that children put into cooperative learning groups, which are based upon heterogeneous sort of groupings, so children of different sort of attainment levels, boys and girls, different ethnicities, etc., given a common task to work together towards a common goal, are able to achieve at higher levels than traditionally taught classrooms. Um, People like Keith Topping, who's up in Scotland, if he's still there, I think Keith's probably retired by now, else talked about peer tutoring in quite sort of simple, sort of like drill and practice sort of context. Do you need to actually have a teacher sort of telling you that your mathematics um, problems are correct or incorrect? If you pair a child up with another child, you give your answer, the child gives the other, a different answer, and they discuss who's right, who's wrong, how did you get it? That peer tutoring sort of situation tends to enhance children's sort of cognitive advancement. Um, again, from Piagetian background, which I've already gone into, we've got this notion that children learn within social contexts, and the different types of pairings that you put children in can be more cognitively challenging or less cognitively challenging. If you look into Vygotskian perspectives, again, in classrooms, probably one of the biggest misconstruals of Vygotsky is his definition of the zone of proximal development. I'd imagine most of you will have come across that. It tends to be sort of introduced into a hierarchical sort of setting of having a more advantaged peer or a tutor with a less advantaged sort of children. But Vygotskian explanations, if you look into his book of Genesis of Higher Mental Functions and elsewhere, finds a lot of mutual collaboration that goes on between people who may have different perspectives but have no more knowledge than one another. So this whole notion of being able to interact with one another becomes important. Um, Again, Christine Howe's work with Neil Mercer. Neil particularly looks at sort of classroom dialogue and collaborative talk within classrooms to see how children sort of can advance with each other. The more that they're allowed to talk to each other, the more that they have sort of a common means rather than being differentiated, the more attainment is likely to come out from it. Right. A few very last sort of qualifications on this, and as you see, the end of the talk is I've really sort of moved away from differentiating children to asking what do children actually have in common. Um, And again, studies that I've done with Peter Blatchford, we've taken sort of a relational approach in terms of enhancing group work within classroom. What's fundamental to the relational approach is that we know from early on when I talked about if teachers allowed children to sit with whomever they wanted, they would probably choose their friendships. And within those friendships, they would be defined by sex, they'd be defined by attainment level, and you'd actually find children sort of having sort of homogeneous groups developing within the classrooms themselves. But what happens if you got all children in the classroom to develop sort of trust, security, communication skills with all other children in the classroom, such that if a child wants to talk, they don't talk to just a preferred friend, they now have the relational ability to talk with any other child in the class. When you start doing studies to enhance children's relationships, again, compared to traditionally taught classrooms, when you have relational based groupings um, over time, studies that we've done in primary and secondary schools show that the achievement at reading, in science, in mathematics is at a much higher level compared to children who are traditionally taught in classrooms. But the basic point is that if I go back to like Neil Mercer's work and say we talk about collaboration, good idea. It shows that uh, advanced cognitive advancements are likely to take place in the collaboration that children have. But ask the first question, say, what happens if the children don't like each other? Will they collaborate? The relational approach tries to get over sort of the liking not liking scenario and make the children more easily accessible to sort of talking with everyone else in the class. And hence, in some of our limited studies, we even see children sort of integrating autistic spectrum children into their groups because they know these children, whereas they may not always talk in the most sort of understandable way, have things to contribute by their drawings, by other activities and capabilities that they've got. So in end, I started out to say talking about sort of differentiating children by their ability between sort of the homogeneous and heterogeneous sort of groupings. And within that, we see that there isn't on average a great deal of difference. You can advantage high attaining children if you keep them in homogeneous groups, but at the same time, you're then disadvantaging sort of low attaining children. If you move into mixed ability sort of grouping within classrooms, number one, you need to not just let children work with their preferred partners because you'll probably get the same type of stereotypical behavior within the classroom. Hence, you need to develop some sort of collaborative or cooperative mechanism, and you actually need to be aware of the quality of relationships that children have with other children within their classrooms. I think that's probably just about it. So at that point, let me just stop and ask whether there's any questions.
It's Thank you very much. It's fascinating, Peter. We have a lot of conversation going on in the chat box. The first question comes from, I think, Joy. If you can see the chat box, it says, thank you very much. Great insights for the sector. Interestingly, in the UK, most primary settings tend to avoid homogeneous grouping. Sorry, there is one more question because I think Becky Taylor answered that. Okay, the question asks, what is the current status of studies within classrooms? Teaching and learning has changed a great deal within the last 20 years in England. And so, how up to date is the cited work, you think?
If you particularly look at the Francis studies, that goes that was 2017. Those publications, and they've carried on. I think it's that it's probably still carries on. That certainly governments in the UK do not perceive there's a greater need for heterogeneous classes, and there is movement if you go down into primary schools that a number of subject areas will sort of create sort of attainment groups, differentiated attainment groups, and so there isn't. To my mind, there isn't an awful lot of hope that the classes are changing.
Okay, the next question comes as, are there complementary studies into the efficacy of current teacher training?
That's a good
How much
question.
of this knowledge is being translated and shared, do you think?
I can only give you an England-based example from that. I've been out of teacher training for a number of years, and so I couldn't give you a real answer except for the fact that in England, in both primary schools and secondary schools, the teacher training tends to focus on particular sort of curriculum knowledge, and not in terms of the social dynamics of the classroom. So, say, as a psychologist and a social and a developmental psychologist, that I would have very little sort of input into a year of, say, a postgraduate teacher training, only a few hours. And to be able to explain sort of developmental characteristics, social characteristics, grouping characteristics in a couple of hours is very, 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 very difficult. So the curriculum predomination in terms of teacher training tends to be based on not really thinking about those social dynamics in the classroom.
Next question comes as very important. Actually, it's not a question, it's a comment, I guess. Very important research for local authorities, perhaps governments as well, to think about as they work to address the problem of closing the attainment gap, which seems to be growing rather than closing despite efforts.
Yes, yes, absolutely true that the attainment gap is, if anything, is probably expanding because there tends to be much more of this differentiation within classrooms and between classes. And there just doesn't seem, I mean, it is strange. You working through the 90s, the early 2000s, governments just they talk about working on sort of an evidential base, but they only seem to want the evidence that allows them to promote their view. And consistently, certainly in the UK, both across conservative governments and Labour governments, differentiation seems to be their priority rather than looking at, at the same time, you've got massive inclusion problems within classrooms. And they just don't seem to pay heed to this at all.
Okay, there is another comment and question mix. Thank you. I have taught for years in Norway and find it much harder to make students in, I think, heterogeneous classes collaborate. They seem to lack the skill or will to expose themselves.
It is interesting. I've got a colleague that's taught in Norway as well, and there seems to be a very strong sort of almost call it a cultural profile of individualism. But on the other hand, that if you when I ended up talking about the relational approach that myself and Peter Blatchford work with, you know, whether you've been trained to be an individual because that tends to be the characteristic of your society, that's one thing. But teachers can take the responsibility to forego some curriculum time and spend some time developing trust and interdependence within the classroom. And it needs to take time and effort on the teacher's part in order to do so. Otherwise, children just won't naturally do it within Western societies. If you have more collective societies, and again, there would be studies that go back into the 1960s, which compare in Israel about children that are brought up on the kibbutz versus children that are brought up in the city. And when some sort of collective action is required, that the kibbutz children just immediately have gone into it, where the city children will look at what's best for themselves. So that type of cultural atmosphere that you grow up in is going to set certain sort of standards. But it's not to say that those are absolute standards that you can't provide alternatives within your classroom.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So the next question comes, how good is the understanding of how you can tailor teaching method to students' ability level to optimize learning rather than just go faster through the syllabus per cognitive acceleration?
Well, I mean, there's a political sort of underlying question to that. So I may not answer that question directly. The question seems to say, how can I do best for each individual child within that class? If you take a more collective orientation and say, do children need to be differentiated to such an extent that they can't share their knowledge with other children? Do children have only responsibility for themselves and their self-knowledge, or do children also have responsibility to other children in the class to share that knowledge? Now, if you go one way towards, is it just the individual child who must progress, as opposed to, is there some sort of collective sense that we share together? There will always be differences in attainment, whether you share collectively, But if you also have a joint responsibility to help others rather than just to improve yourself, then you create a slightly different dynamic within the classroom. So hence, the direct answer to that question of looking at the individual child and that individual child's development, yes, you're going to need a differentiated curriculum, that the more advanced children are going to need more advanced questions. And the less advanced children are going to be something that they can grasp and move forward with. So they're going to be working at different sort of levels within the classroom. I mean, teachers have well, a very, very difficult job. I mean, I am in awe when I go into a classroom and I see the kids sort of responding to the teacher sort of active with them, and you getting the class sort of moving. But in end, you need to, I guess there is that underlying level of politics that says, do we just teach to the individual, or are there other responsibilities to go on, more collective responsibilities?
You. There is a clarification question. Have I understood correctly that non-streaming may work for typical children, but what about children with SEND?
This is a problem that the SEND children. It's a problem at a number of different levels. It first of all depends what the actual sort of problem has been identified to get sort of a SEND recommendation put on the child. Secondly, who works with the child? If we look historically within England and go back to 1964 with the Warnock report, which recommended that the closing of special schools where the SEND children may have gone in the past, the integration of SEND children into mainstream classrooms, the lowering of class sizes, and at the same time, the lowering of class sizes, that the mainstream teachers would be re-educated, given more help and support to include the SEND children within their classroom. Basically, what happened since then is class sizes have not been lower. The special schools, or a number of special schools, have been closed. The SEND children have been integrated into mainstream classrooms, and schools tend to then bring in teaching assistants, which tend to be assigned to classrooms. Now, Warnock identified the role of teaching assistants, but the role of teaching assistants were to take on the majority of the class, so that the actual classroom teacher, who has most of the educational sort of training, would work with the SEND children at times. What basically seems to happen in classrooms these days is the teaching assistant, again, who has got less background in education support and development, tends to be assigned to work with the SEND children. So, aside from disadvantaging them by putting them into a mainstream class that does not have a smaller class size, they're also then being given sort of their educational support by someone who's got less training than the proper teacher. So basic problems from that. If you're interested in that and ways to overcome, Peter Blatchford's work at the start of the 2020s has got a lot of information on that. So I don't know if I've answered the question, except to identify that I see that there is that problem, and it's very difficult for certainly schools in England at this day and age to overcome that problem because of all that pressure that's been put upon them, sort of maintaining class size, and just bringing in sort of teaching assistants. That's not to demean teaching assistants, because some teaching assistants are fantastic, are excellent at their job, but they haven't gone through a number of years of training and experience the way that teachers have. They don't have the grasp of the curriculum to the extent that teachers would have, etc. So, okay.
Following this, there is a long comment by Ellie. I think the difficulty with SEND is each child can have such differing strengths and weaknesses. I think